Perhaps the most convincing piece of evidence of Jesus' resurrection is the impact that the resurrection had on the life of Jesus' disciples. You'll notice that in John chapter 20, verse 1, John gives us a seemingly unimportant detail. Mary visited the tomb on the first day of the week. Every one of the Gospels reports it this way. And what we have to keep in mind is that John is writing this Gospel some 30 plus years after the events actually took place. And with this detail, he's telling us something important about a development within the life of the church over that period of time. Before the resurrection, the major day of worship was on Saturday. But when we read about the early church, we notice that they worship on the first day of the week. Acts chapter 20, verse 7 says, "Now on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread." 1 Corinthians chapter 16 says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up." Revelation chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. "I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on the account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day." And you may think, Cliff, what does that have to do with anything, particularly the resurrection? Well, this is actually pretty major. The day of worship for thousands of years, up until that point, had been on the Sabbath, the last day of the week. And you know how hard it is to get people to change tradition. This was not a change based on some mere accommodating of people's schedules. Their lives revolved around Sabbath worship. So something dramatically significant must have taken place so that the common day of worship for this new breed of people changes from Saturday to Sunday. And we know what that something was. It was the resurrection of Jesus, which became known as the Lord's Day. But that's not the only significant impact that was made. We must consider the lives of the followers of Christ. If the Jewish or Roman leaders had stolen the body, all they would have to do is produce the body in order to squelch this movement. If the disciples had stolen the body, then they surely would not have given over the entirety of their lives, most of them dying in martyrdom, all of them suffering persecution for this very cause, for something that they knew to be a lie. Why do that if it was all a big hoax that they themselves concocted? But we know that not to be the case. They were terrified of the Jewish authorities after the crucifixion. They thought they were next on the hit list. But once they saw the resurrected Christ and they were filled with His promise of His Spirit, their fuse was lit and nothing kept them from declaring the resurrection to all people. As we read historical accounts of the disciples' lives, even accounts outside of the Bible, they testify to the bold and dramatic shift. The book of Acts says that these disciples were turning the world upside down. They were willing to be beaten, stoned, thrown to the lions, burned at the stake, and it wasn't because they thought Jesus had a good philosophy of life or really insightful maxims for living. It was because they saw the resurrected Christ, and they knew Him to be Lord of all. Do you know Him this way? If you're a follower of Christ, I want to invite you to pray today, and that you would please remember Reina Costa El Haj and her family, our missionaries in Lebanon. And also remember the Enzima Lifeword broadcast heard throughout Ghana and the Ivory Coast.